Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you tell from the title up there, it is time for another movie review. And this, of course, is a movie that I did review once long ago. I believe it was on the previous channel. And I haven't really touched on this, except for a fan commentary I did a couple years ago. But it's time to do a proper review on this channel. That, of course, is of the Mel Brooks classic that was written by him and Gene Wilder. It, of course, is Young Frankenstein. Now, of course, this is my Mel Brooks collection. Of course, it has most of his films on here. The only ones that are really missing are the producers, which I still scratch my head why the one he won an Academy Award for is not on here. Life Stinks, one of the few non-spoof comedies he directed. But instead of that, we get a film he only produced, which is To Be or Not to Be. But I believe just about the rest of his films are on here. Like got 12 Chairs, Blazing Saddles, Silent Movie Hunt. Yeah, those are the only two of his movies not on. Oh, stand corrected. Dracula Dead and Loving It's also not on here. So 3 of his films are not on here. But even without that, this is a good collection. And of course, you got Prison Scroob on the cover. You got to go good with that. Salute, hail Scroob. Now, Young Frankenstein. Now, as I've mentioned in other videos, I grew up on these classic monster movies. Now, while I didn't watch a lot of them when I was young, like, say, James Rolfe did, I was fascinated by them. The books in the library about my elementary school that always talked with them, I would always check out and read. I did watch the original Frankenstein when I was young, and then as I managed to get access to the other Frankenstein films, slowly but surely I managed to watch it. And one time, I watched the original Frankenstein and this film back-to-back on AMC, and that's when I started to realize that this film was a full-on spoof of that. But before that, I first saw this film on one of the paid-for channels. I forget which one it is now, but it was a random airing. And I believe I started watching it like a quarter of the way through, and I loved it. And it was a film that once I got it on DVD, I repeatedly watched it. Me and my abuela, we always had a lot of fond memories of watching it. And there's one, of course, scene that she always laughed at. My grandfather's work was doo-doo. And, of course, it's a film that as I get older, I just love it even more, especially as I start to realize what they're spoofing with it. Of course, that came from having read the original novel, having read it multiple times, in fact, having watched some of the older Frankenstein films repeatedly, and of course getting a greater appreciation and understanding of what satire is, and of course Brooks' comedic wit in his direction style. And with this one, it's not only making this film feel from a technical standpoint like it's one of the classic films, but it is also knowing just how much fun to poke at it. Because unlike some of his other spoofs like Spaceballs and the previous film Blazing Saddles, it doesn't go that far into the fourth wall breaking. This is probably his most straight of his spoof comedies, if that makes any sense, to where you understand what he's making fun of, but the way it plays, if you did not know it was a spoof, you would assume it is a very prolonged sequel to those classic films, which was the intention of the screenwriter Gene Wilder. In fact, that started with a conversation they had, which both Gene and Mel had mentioned in multiple interviews, that when they were filming Blazing Saddles, which, of course, Gene was not the original person playing the Waco Kid in that film. He was a replacement. So when he got brought on, they were talking about the projects, like, I'm thinking of doing another Frankenstein. And at first Mel was like, yeah, no, Frankenstein has been a lot. But Mel heard him out and he liked the idea. And so they agreed that Mel and Gene would do that film together next. Of course, one of Gene's few provisos was Mel could not make a cameo appearance like he liked to do in his films. The only cameo he made, of course, was the ad-lib joke of the dart hitting the cat. And then, of course, him doing the off-screen narration of the grandfather. They were shopping this film around for a little bit when they were in the initial stages of production, even before pre-production. But their first issue was that a couple of the studios were very hesitant about making this film in black and white. In fact, one of the first offers they got was like, okay, we'll print it in black and white, we got to fill it on this color stark. And Mel immediately knew that they were going to screw them. And he laid out why that that's going to be a no-go, because he felt that even though he had a little bit of stroke at this point in his career, that they would pull it away from him and make it in color. So he decided to take the project to 20th Century Fox, where Alan Ladd, the new person in charge, was very accommodating with it. And of course, Alan Ladd, he was there for the next couple years, and you see his name pop up again in other ones like Star Wars, Aliens, and a couple other films around that time. But he seemed to be one of the voices of reason at Fox, especially when you look at Fox in later years before they were bought by Disney, where they had questionable people in control. That seems to be a wave thing with Hollywood, is you got people very accommodating within reason, and then you get people that don't know what the heck they're doing running the ship, and then you got people that are accommodating one day and then don't know what they're doing the next. Now, one lovely find that Mel managed to do while they were actually in production was he discovered that Ken Strickfaden, the genius who made the lab equipment for the original film and its sequels, was still alive, living in LA, and as chance would have it, had all that equipment stored in his garage. So Mel made a deal to rent the equipment, and in return, he gave Strickfaden the on-screen credit he didn't receive in the original films. Which, the fact that he didn't get credit in those films is not surprising, because usually only the people who are in charge of certain things, like with makeup, only the person in charge of the department will get credit, other than like maybe like additional makeup by someone, something, or like first assistant to blah blah blah, something like that. Nowadays, just about everybody involved in the film goes on there, as they should, unless they ask not to be credited for whatever reason. Usually for more money or some other type of contractual issue. And the fact that we have that equipment from the original films in this film helps with that continuity and helps us feel like it is a sequel, even though technically, since it's coming from another studio, it's not. But it helps with that feeling. In addition to the fact that Gene and Mel write it as such, and then Mel directs it as such, other than some more comedy. Now, since I brought up the Blu-ray, there are a lot of great special features on here, like the making of covers it amazingly. They have some interviews from Mexico from around that time period, which that's probably my least favorite feature on here, but it's an interesting little piece for archival purposes. All the trailers and stuff from around the times. I love Mel's sense of humor in it, in black and white. No offense. And then there's a bit of dialogue in there that's not in the film. Storm the castle. It's done by Mel's longtime collaborator, John Morris, who did a lot of his other films. Like they mention High Anxiety, his follow-up film, which is a spoof of Hitchcock's films. They mention, of course, Silent Movie, which is one of Mel's films I haven't seen as I'm recording this. And he's done a bunch of other films that Mel was involved with. Like, if I remember correctly, he did The Elephant Man and some other Brooks Films ones. And he was a musical genius. And, of course, his violin score for this, not only does it help that little spoof continuity purpose from the original Frankenstein films, but on its own, it is a beautiful piece of music. Da-na-na-na, na-na-na. And apparently I'm not the only one who feels that way, because it's actually been covered on violin albums by master virtuosos of the craft of violining, because it is such a beautiful piece. And even though I can think of pieces of musical score from the other Frankenstein films, this is probably the best piece of music I've heard from any of the Frankenstein films, and it's coming from the spoof one. That should tell you something about it. Of course, there's probably his rendition of Putting on the Ritz that is sung by Gene Wilder and Peter Boyle. Of course, Peter with his little almost 10 minutes into the video, I haven't even done a synopsis of the actual plot yet. Well, I'm going to try to keep the plot synopsis more general, but just so you know, I will be talking about some spoilers in here. Late in the video I'll be mentioning that. But anyway, the plot begins with a will being collected from the grave of the current Dr. Frankenstein's great-great-grandfather. Oh, excuse me, great-grandfather, only one great. And it's brought to him, and right from the beginning we see that while Frankenstein has no issue with using his family's surname, he still wants to try to distance himself from his grandfather's legacy. And one way he does that is changing the pronunciation. Instead of Frankenstein, it's Frankenstein. tries to distance himself from his grandfather's experiments, even though he is in a similar field. He is a medical doctor. He does do all that stuff, and as we see in his introductory scene, he's giving a lecture on the brain, so he's still a couple steps away from there. He's given the will, and the will, its contents were never told what they are in the final film, but keep that in mind when I bring up deleted scenes in a bit, because there are a couple that do touch on it. Well, after getting the will, Victor has to go to Transylvania and do whatever the will stipulates. I mean, even when you know what the deleted scenes are in the context of it, the will kind of disappears after this part of the story. So it is a MacGuffin in the Hitchcockian sense, where it gets the plot rolling, but then, But at least with the scenes in context, it makes a little bit more sense. But even without them, it's like, yeah, he's going to go settle the will. Well, he shows up and he's introduced to our side characters. They're, of course, Inga and Igor. Oh, wait. My mistake. It's pronounced Igor. Played by Terry Garr and Marty Feldman, respectively. And, of course, with Marty Feldman's introduction, this is where we get the infamous, or should I say famous scene that started a gag that was reused in multiple other Mel Brooks films, Walk This Way. And of course that scene is also responsible for a famous classic rock song by Aerosmith. I'm sure you've heard of that one. They all end up at the castle where we're introduced to Cloris Leachman's character, Frau Blucher. And of course, it's a joke everybody talks about, the whole thing with the horses neighing at her name. And for a long time there was a misconception that the Blucher meant glue in German, and that's why they're all afraid, the horses, is because they're going to go to the glue factory, which is not the case. And I know that even Mel and them made a joke about the fact that she's named after some German officer with the last name Blucher, who was apparently responsible for the deaths of many horses in cavalry charges, which I guess would be a little interesting for the horses, but that's not the case. The whole reason that the horses neigh at her is to show the audience that she is not the most trustworthy person, and there's something wrong with her. And I love the way that Gene Wilder himself even talked about it in interviews, where it's like, heaven knows what she does to the horses when no one else is around. And it's a case that even when they're not in the room, just a mention of her name. I just love that running gag, even though after a while it does kind of disappear, but that's because her name stops being mentioned. We know who she is. That night, Victor has a nightmare. He wakes up, and through some convoluted gags, he ends up in his grandfather's library, and he's introduced to his grandfather's journal. And this was an excellent way to introduce dialogue from Mary Shelley's novel. Whereas in that one, it was the ravings of Victor as he's slowly dying, talking to Walden. Here, it's his journal. And of course, it gets Victor into the Frankenstein mindset, and they decide they're going to make a monster. And here we get parodies of the famous scene involving the grave robbing and of course the creation of the monster, which a lot of the humor there is stuff that just writes itself. They create the monster, it escapes, and we get more parodies of classic scenes from the Universal scenes. We get a play on the blind man scene with Gene Hackman playing the blind man in a classic role. And even though he is playing it a little straight, it's the situation itself where the humor comes from. They'll play on the little girl scene, the famous scene from the original Frankenstein film. And of course, they catch the monster, and we get the putting on the Ritz moment. And it does have a happy ending, which is more than you can say for a lot of these Frankenstein films. But I think that's what adds to the heart and a little bit to the humor here, is that if the first time you're watching it and you know about previous Frankenstein films, you think it's going to have a tragic ending. Because every Frankenstein film has an ending that is tragic in some regard. At least all the ones I can think of. The original one, if you look at it just in a vacuum of that film, the monster and his creator die together. The second one, while the doctor and Elizabeth make it out, the monster kills himself, Dr. Pretorius, and the mate, you know, that moment, we belong dead. I guess you could say Son of Frankenstein kind of has a happy ending, even though they end up a lot of people get injured and all that, and of course the monster gets knocked into the sulfur. Goes to Frankenstein, the house burns down, and of course in Mary Shelley's by Brana follows a little bit of the book's ending, so definitely has a tragic ending. Here, though, it is a happy ending for everyone. The monster gets what he wants, the doctor gets what he wants, villagers kind of get what they want, but not to the full extent. And of course the ending, it's such a Mel Brooks ending. It is a little bit of an adult one, so if you're going to show this to your kids when they're younger, you might want to think on it. But I would say it is still ambiguous enough that it might fly over their heads. Like, I didn't fully understand it when I saw it when I was young, but as an adult I'm like, ha ha, I get joke. A lot of the humor in this film, like I said, it writes itself based on what they're spoofing. Such as the Flower Girl one, like there's one quick shot of the monster where you think, oh no, what's going through his head? If you know the original scene, you're like, oh crap, he's gonna throw the girl in the well. Oh no, oh thank goodness he's not. And then the blind man scene, if you know the original scene there, you know what it's referencing, like the whole soup thing, based on a scene in Bride of Frankenstein. But in that one, he gets the balls, puts it in the thing, and then puts it in the table with bread. Whereas this one, it's him using the ladle, and he's blind, so go back and forth, and then right into the crotch, and then the monster, it's like it just writes itself, and then the breaking of it, and then of course lighting his thumb on fire, another reference to the original film. And of course it ends with Gene Hackman's classic ad-lib, I was gonna make espresso. I mean, it's a line that people have thrown in multiple scenes now, but then it was fresh, and it's such a classic way to end it, even though they do have to quickly edit around it, considering that the cast and crew burst out laughing after the line. But I gotta give Hackman that applaud for that line. Of course, the creation, it's not successful. In most of these films, the creation goes through and then it's like, it's alive! It's alive! The only example I can think of off the top of my head is once again Brana's Frankenstein, where there's the delay one, but even then he's like, it's alive. This one, it's so long delayed that it looks like it's a failure, which adds to the humor, especially if you only are watching it for the first time, because you expect that the monster's going to be brought to life, and then you're like, ah. And of course, you know, quiet, dignity, and grace. And of course, the villagers constantly referencing the fact this is not the first time they've dealt with this type of situation. You know, 5 times before, the 5 previous Universal Frankenstein films. Yeah, of course, Inspector Kemp, played by the legendary Kenneth Mars, of course, parody of the Inspector character from Son of Frankenstein, even down to having a wooden arm. Even though the whole reason for that is in one of the deleted scenes where we find out the same thing, ripped out. Then, of course, even without that, if you know about the character he's spoofing, when he actually does get ripped out at the end, even though it's accidental, you understand what it's referencing. Oh, yeah. And of course, like I mentioned, the grave digger scene. The humor there is that if you know the original scene, down fool. Of course, this is a filthy job. Oh, it could be worse. Could be raining. That's like, yeah. And then, of course, the stealing the brain scene. Of course, there, it's played for humor, but it's more or less played the same way as in the original film, only with a little bit more added humor. Now, of course, there was added dialogue in some of the alternate takes. Like, there's the quip that was edited out where Igor's like, funny thing is, I tried. But then in one of the takes that's on the Blu-ray, which is the first time I watched those ones, he looks at it, he's like, I can read, but without this, we have no monster. How else are we going to make a monster? Of course, showing off the creature, something that a modern Dr. Frankenstein most likely would do if he managed to successfully create life. And they do go into the nature-nurture thing just a little bit. Whereas in the original films, they make it seem like most of the monsters' negative things is caused by the abnormal brain and a little bit of how he's treated. Because when he's treated with kindness in those films, he gives kindness in return. I mean, his friend, the blind man, everything's fine until the hunters show up. The little girl, of course, you know, they're kind of friends until he inadvertently kills her because he doesn't know the difference between flowers and human. And of course, nice little thing with Karloff being the one cast there. And then of course, in a weird way, Pretorius getting to him. The Doctor had just done the same thing without, of course, Fritz being a jackass. It would have worked. They do touch on that a bit. Now, this is where I got to bring the deleted scenes in a little bit, and after I make this point, I'll talk about a few more of them. And one of the deleted scenes, we see there's a scene before they try to get through to the monster where they're reading more of the grandfather's journal, and we find out that due to the abnormal brain, even without it, as to how the monster is made, there's really going to be a lot of that subconscious stuff with it, and you really got to get through to it with love. Hence, you know, the whole thing, love is the only thing that can save this poor creature. And showing the monster that he is loved is what gets through to him. I mean, there's that scene where, you know, he gets the monster to break down crying. That's something you would expect in one of these films, the monster to break down crying like that. And even though later films would show it, it kind of makes sense if you look at the psychology of the monster in the original Universal films. All he would want is a family, and that's one of the things, if you look at the book, paramount, because what happens to the monster? First, he's rejected by essentially his father, and then he's rejected by the whole of humanity, so he is unloved. And that's the main reason he wants a mate in that one. Here, by the end of the film, he does find his love. One, in the fact that he has a wife, and then of course he's accepted by his whole family and in the community at large. And of course, it's another way to get the articulate monster like he is in the book, so there's that. And that whole scene, it's not really necessary to the plot, but it adds a little bit more added context to why they decide they're going to try the whole love bombing, to use an ADHD term, thing on the monster, and it works. Now, other parts, there's full-on deleted scenes, and then there's stuff that they cut out. Like in the putting on the Ritz, they trimmed down the lead into it, which makes it make a little bit more sense that they're showing off the motor function. And if you look at it quickly, it also adds a little bit more context for why Igor is there, why he seems to not have his hump. That was to be the penultimate reveal for the whole moving hump gag, which I haven't talked about yet, but where we find out that he doesn't really have a hump. I can get why that was in there, but I also see why it was cut. It's probably showing that he probably did not inherit his hump like his grandfather had, so he's just doing it to keep up appearances. And of course taking it off to be a little bit more respectable for the respectable folks. Now, the full-on deleted scenes, we have the reading of the will, which is a fun little scene in isolation. However, it's not one that's needed for the film, even though it is fun to hear the great-grandfather on the audio will. You're like, we're rolling, aren't we? Yeah, yes. I'll kill you if you screw this up. And of course, the rest of the Frankenstein family being happy they'll inherit it unless Victor meets a certain thing, and they're finding out that he is steps away from meeting it, and them trying to disregard it. But of course, then the scene between Frankenstein and Herr Folkstein where they're talking about the will. And this scene is where we get a little bit more added context about the famous theme that Morse composed, at least some in-universe lore for it, where it's an old Transylvanian lullaby. And of course, like what Frau Blucher says in her one scene, it is at the soul of all Frankensteins. It's a nice little bit of lore there and a little added context there, and of course shows that Herr Folkstein is thinking at the beginning like, he's a Frankenstein. And of course there's the Highwayman one, which is a scene in between the blind man and them capturing the monster, where the guy tries to rob the monster, which is like, why would you try to do that? And of course the monster easily pushes past him, but the gag at the end, I need glasses, I gotta see these people. It's a nice little funny moment there. And those are the main ones that stand out at me with the deleted scenes, both the original full scenes, except for one other one, and that is that there was actually a full scene where Victor and Inga talk about what they end up doing off screen. And it's not really needed, but you can see why they threw it in there, and you can see why it's one of the things that's cut. It's where they talk about infidelity, and all that thing. It's one of those things I can see why they cut, just to make the Doctor a little bit more likable, even though we see what he does afterwards. It's just seeing him talk about it in a roundabout manner. It's one of those ones where you're like, yeah. especially in a film where you're trying to make the Doctor more likable. So I see why it's cut out. And of course another reason is that apparently the original edit of the film did not play super well. And even watching the deleted scenes, I can kind of see why. Even for the ones that I say add more context and all that, they probably bogged the pacing down. And more importantly, since this is a comedy, you need it to be funny. And here's the thing. I will take a boring drama, a boring horror film, over an unfunny comedy. Because if a comedy's not funny, then it's failed at its primary mission. And in the original cut, it seems for every joke that worked, there was 2 or 3 that didn't. So what they did is they went out and cut out all the jokes that didn't work. Now, just watching these deleted and extended scenes, it's hard to imagine that all we're seeing there is the stuff that didn't work, especially since some of what we're seeing is also B-roll to show how they filmed certain ones. And since I watched that before I watched the film, going back and watching it, I'm like, oh, that's a nice little show of how edited it is, especially when it's like a couple takes of the same scene, but they're from different angles, so you can see like how the camera focuses on one thing and how it will shift as they're filming the take. And then of course when they do the final edit using that angle, you see how it works. And then seeing all the other angles they have to get for coverage. But that's one thing I like about filming, is that good coverage can save you in the edit. This film shows one, and then of course Pee-wee's Big Adventure, another good example. Especially as they cut down a character's prominence with that edit. And of course, them getting it down to its core elements and all it needed, it definitely helped save the film. Because if they showed that original version from how I hear it is, this film would probably not be regarded as the classic it is. Now, this film was made on a budget of $2.8 million, which for modern senses, that would be $17.8 million. Which is still not a large budget, but that's what it'd be if you were to adjust it. And it made $86.2 million, which, when adjusted for inflation, is $550.8 million, which that one does sound like a lot. I mean, relative to his budget, a $17 million budget, grossing that, yeah, that is a very good gross. Even when you take Hollywood accounting into it, that is an excellent gross. That's like one of these Marvel films grossing over $3 billion. Now, this is the part of the review where I usually will bring in some of the added trivia, but I think I've covered a lot of it while doing the lead up to it, and then bring in other stuff. But this is one that I love, and that is that when they were finished filming, they were so upset that photography was completed that they added scenes to continue shooting. Now, some of those are probably the ones that ended up on the cutting room floor. And while they do mention this story in passing in the making of on here, and it's Gene Wilder that brings it up, they never specify what scenes they were. I have a feeling like the actor's march at the end is probably one. Maybe the Highwayman might have been one. But I would have liked for them to mention which ones they were. And of course, now I think of it, probably the funny thing is I tried is one gag that was cut for not being funny. Yeah. And that's really all there is to say about this film. It definitely is one of my favorite Frankenstein films. I put it up there with the original ones, and like I mentioned earlier, if you did not know this was a satire and you watched it, like let's say you watched this after Ghost of Frankenstein, or even after the next couple ones, even though they really don't have a lot of continuity between them, it's very, very loose, it would fit in there. It would just seem like a more humorous version of it, which I know some people go, well, that doesn't really work. Abbott and Costello made Frankenstein. You can watch that work like it's in continuity or its own separate thing. It's up to you when you watch it. But even if you just watch it as a spoof, it is a loving spoof. And for the most part, it is played straight, like I said, but there are a couple moments where you can tell Brooks is the one directing it because of how everything acts. And it is the best kind of spoof, where you're not making fun of the stuff maliciously, you're making fun of it because you are a fan. And those spoofs are always usually the best ones. At least when it comes to like material like this. And that's really all I have to say about Young Frankenstein. It does come with my highest glowing recommendation. Like I said, if you've never seen it and you're a fan of the Universal Monster movies, definitely watch it because you will have a fun time. And of course, you'll be walking this way. Till next time, everybody.